The wind was a living thing on the prairie, a constant, keening voice that spoke of vast, empty spaces in a sky so large it could swallow a soul whole. Elara stood on the rickety porch of her sod house, her knuckles white as she gripped the rough-hewn rail. Before her, the land she and Thomas had claimed stretched out in a sea of tawny grass, rippling like a restless ocean under a sky bruised with the purple and orange of a dying day. It was beautiful, in a terrifying, indifferent way. A year. It had been a year since the fever took him. A year since the light had gone out of the world, leaving her alone with 80 acres of stubborn soil, a stubborn cow, and a grief so profound it felt like a physical weight in her chest. Inside, the sod house was dark and cool, smelling of damp earth and wood smoke. It was a single room, dug into the side of a small rise, its walls a lattice of rooted grass and dirt. Thomas had called it their Earth Castle, his voice always laced with that wry humor that could make even despair seem like a temporary guest. Now, it felt less like a castle and more like a tomb. She built a small fire in the hearth, the flames doing little to push back the encroaching chill of the autumn evening. Her hands, once soft and accustomed to piano keys and embroidery needles, were now calloused and strong, etched with the story of her survival. She pumped water, fed the cow she'd named Stubbornness, and prepared a meager supper of beans and cornbread. Each action was precise, habitual, a ritual performed not for comfort, but for the simple, stark necessity of enduring. This was her life now. A cycle of dawn to dusk labor, a battle against the elements, a silent conversation with a ghost. Her spirit, once as bright and hopeful as the morning sun, had been tempered in the forge of loss. It was not broken. She would not allow it to break. But it was hardened, like flint, capable of throwing sparks but cold to the touch. The next morning, she hitched Stubbornness to the old plow. The blade bit into the tough, root-bound soil with a sound like tearing flesh. The sun beat down, a merciless eye in the bleached blue sky. Sweat stung her eyes and traced clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. With every step, every jarring impact of the plow against a hidden rock, she thought of Thomas. He had been a man of the city, a dreamer with a head full of Homer and a heart full of hope. He'd been clumsy with an axe, poetic about a sunset, and utterly, completely sure that this land was their future. A shadow fell across the furrow. Elara started, her heart leaping into her throat. A man stood at the edge of her field, tall and broad-shouldered, silhouetted against the sun. He led a tired-looking horse, and even at a distance, she could see the dust of long travel caked on his clothes. Her hand went to the handle of the hunting knife she wore on her belt. Loneliness was one thing. Vulnerability was another. "Can I help you?" she called out, her voice sharper than she intended. He took a few steps closer, removing his wide-brimmed hat. His face was weathered, lined around the eyes and mouth, but his gaze was direct and a startling shade of clear, lake-water blue. He was younger than she first thought, perhaps in his late 30s, but life had carved its history deep. "Name's Caleb," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Caleb Holt. I was heading north, saw your smoke. My horse picked up a stone. I was hoping to trouble you for a bit of water and a place to rest him for an hour." He gestured to the horse's lifted foreleg. Elara's eyes narrowed, assessing him. He didn't have the shiftiness of a drifter or the desperate hunger of an outlaw. He looked solid, like the ancient cottonwood that grew by the creek. And his eyes held no pity, only a frank appraisal of his own situation. "The creek's just beyond that rise," she said, pointing with her chin. "You're welcome to its water. There's a patch of grass there for your horse." A faint smile touched his lips. "Much obliged." He didn't move immediately. His gaze swept over the field, the short, struggling furrows she had managed to carve. "Tough ground." "It is," she said, her tone final, a clear boundary. He nodded, as if she'd offered a profound truth, then tipped his hat and led his horse toward the creek. Elara went back to her plowing, but her rhythm was broken. She was acutely aware of his presence just over the rise. An hour later, he reappeared. Without a word, he walked over to where she was struggling with a particularly stubborn root network. "Allow me," he said, and before she could protest, he took the handles of the plow. His strength was immense. With a grunt and a heave, the roots gave way, and the plow surged forward. He worked for perhaps 20 minutes, his movements efficient and powerful, opening up a length of soil that would have taken her the rest of the day. When he was done, he wiped his brow with his bandana. There. Elara stood speechless, a confusing mix of gratitude and resentment warring within her. She was not used to help. Help meant obligation. Help was a door through which disappointment usually walked. Thank you, she managed, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. It's a big job for one person, he said simply. His eyes met hers, and for a fleeting second, she saw not pity, but understanding. He saw the struggle, not the widow. I manage, she said, her spine straightening. I can see that, he replied. He looked toward the horizon. Storm's coming. A big one. You can smell it on the wind. She had smelled it too, the metallic tang of impending rain. I'll be fine. Caleb studied her for a long moment, then his horse, then the darkening clouds gathering in the west. My horse needs another day to rest that leg. I'll sleep in your barn, if you've no objection. I can fix that sagging ridgepole before I go. And your roof could use some patching before that storm hits. It wasn't a request, more a statement of fact. Elara's first instinct was to refuse. But the roof did leak, and the barn was little more than a lean-to. And the storm did look fierce. Her unbreakable spirit warred with simple, pragmatic sense. The barn, she said finally. You can stay in the barn. For one night. His payment was a rabbit he snared at dusk. He skinned and cleaned it with swift, sure hands, and she, in a gesture that felt strangely like a peace offering, added it to the stew pot with her precious store of carrots and onions. They ate in near silence at the small table in the sod house, the space feeling both smaller and less lonely with his presence filling it. He told her he was a carpenter by trade, moving from town to town, following the work of building a new world. He asked no prying questions, for which she was grateful. He simply existed in her space with a quiet, unassuming solidity that was both unsettling and comforting. The next day, true to his word, he set to work on the barn and the roof. Elara watched him when she thought he wasn't looking. The way he handled a hammer was like a kind of music, each strike sure and true. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. He was a man of few words, but his actions were a language of their own. That evening, as he was securing the last patch on the roof, the storm broke. It wasn't just rain, it was a fury. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at the sod and shaking the shutters. Rain fell in solid, blinding sheets, and lightning split the sky with terrifying violence. A particularly vicious gust of wind ripped one of the shutters from its hinge, and it smashed against the side of the house. Elara flinched, a memory of Thomas's fevered ramblings during the storm that had preceded his death flashing behind her eyes. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the sod house tremble around her. A firm knock came at the door. She opened it to find Caleb, soaked to the skin, his hair plastered to his forehead. Chimneys clear, but the wind is trying to tear the world apart, he said, water streaming from his clothes. I'm going to check the livestock. I'll come with you, she said, grabbing her shawl. No, stay here. It's not safe. His tone brooked no argument. He vanished back into the maelstrom. The minutes stretched into an hour. The storm raged on. Elara paced the small room, her anxiety growing with every crash of thunder. What if a tree had fallen on him? What if he was lost in the blinding rain? The thought of another death, of another man lost on her account, was a cold knot in her stomach. When the door finally opened and he stumbled back in, dripping and muddy but unharmed, a wave of relief so powerful it left her dizzy washed over her. The cow is spooked, but safe, he said, his breath misting in the suddenly cold air. The horse is fine. He stood there, shivering slightly, and Elara acted without thought. She fetched the one spare blanket she had, the thick wool one Thomas had prized, and handed it to him. Thank you, he said, his blue eyes holding hers. In their depths, she saw the reflection of the fire, and something else, a warmth that had nothing to do with the flames. He did not leave the next day. The storm had washed out the trail north, and his horse, while better, was not yet fit for a hard journey. He stayed, and he worked. He fixed the broken shutter. He reinforced the barn door. He helped her dig a new storage cellar. And with every passing day, the silence between them grew less empty and more comfortable. They spoke of small things, the habits of the birds, the best way to preserve venison, the books she had read and the places he had seen. Elara found herself watching for him, listening for the sound of his axe or his whistling, a low, tuneful sound that was becoming as familiar as the wind. Her heart, a frozen lake for so long, began to feel the first, treacherous cracks of a thaw. It terrified her. To care was to open herself up to loss. Her unbreakable spirit had been forged in solitude. Would it survive the complication of another? One afternoon, a week after the storm, they were mending a section of fence together. The air was crisp and clean, the sky a brilliant, heart-breaking blue. "You carry it well," Caleb said, not looking at her, his focus on the wire he was twisting. "Carry what?" "The weight," he said. "I've met men who would have buckled under half of it." Elara paused, a fence post heavy in her hands. "I don't have a choice." "Everyone has a choice," he said softly, finally meeting her gaze. "Some choose to give up. You chose to stay." Tears, hot and sudden, pricked at her eyes. She had not cried since Thomas died. She had believed her tears were all spent, dried up by the sun and wind of the prairie. She turned away, ashamed. "Elara." He said her name for the first time, and the sound of it on his lips was a revelation. She felt his hand, gentle on her shoulder. It was the first time he had touched her. The simple warmth of it was almost her undoing. "It's all right to put it down for a minute," he murmured. "The weight. I'll hold it for you." And with those words, the dam broke. She didn't sob, but the tears came, silent and steady, tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks just as the sweat had done. She cried for Thomas, for the dreams they had buried here. She cried for the long, lonely months. She cried for the fear and the exhaustion. And through it all, he just stood there, his hand a steady, warm pressure on her shoulder, his presence a silent fortress against the vast, empty sky. When the tears subsided, she felt hollowed out, but clean. Lighter. She turned to face him. His eyes were full of a deep, patient kindness. "I can't," she began, her voice hoarse. "I can't go through that again. The losing." Caleb nodded slowly. "I know," he said. "I ain't asking you to. I'm just a man, fixing a fence. But I'm also a man who sees the strongest person he's ever met. And a spirit like that, it isn't meant to endure alone forever. It's meant to build, to grow." He didn't speak of love. He didn't make grand promises. He spoke of reality, of the land, of the work. And in that, she found a truth more compelling than any poetry. His horse healed. The trail dried. The day of his leaving arrived as inevitably as the sunrise. Elara stood with him by the repaired barn, the morning sun warm on their faces. The silence between them was thick with everything unspoken. "The north is calling," he said, his voice quiet. "Is it?" she asked, her heart a wild drum in her chest. He looked out over her land, at the furrows they had plowed together, at the sturdy roof, at the woman who had carved a life from nothing. Then he looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw not an ending, but a question. "I was thinking," he said, "that there might be work here for a carpenter. A permanent sort of work. This land, it could use a second pair of hands. A house of wood, maybe, to replace the sod. A proper home." Elara's breath caught. She looked at his honest face, at the blue eyes that had seen her grief and not looked away. She thought of her unbreakable spirit, how it had endured the hardship, how it had survived the storm. But survival was not the same as living. Living required courage of a different kind, the courage to hope again, to build again, to love again. Her spirit was not a fortress to be kept isolated and safe. It was a hearth, meant to offer warmth. It was a foundation, strong enough to build a future upon. She took a step toward him, closing the distance between them. She placed her calloused hand in his larger, rougher one. "I think," she said, her voice clear and steady as the prairie sky after a storm, "that a proper home sounds like a fine idea." A slow, genuine smile spread across Caleb's face, transforming his weathered features. It was a smile of promise, of a future written not in dreams, but in the honest soil beneath their feet. He didn't kiss her, not then. He simply held her hand, their linked fingers a bridge between a past of solitude and a future of shared purpose. The unbreakable spirit of the pioneer woman had endured. It had weathered the storm of loss and the drought of despair. And now, in the quiet strength of a new love, it found not an end to its trials, but a companion for the journey. The hardship was not over, the land would always demand its price. But she would no longer face it alone. Together, they would build something that would last, their love as enduring and resilient as the western sky.